I'm a huge believer in the paranormal, and I feel that if everyone experienced some of the things I have, they would be too. I'm a huge believer that any negative environment can become a portal into the spirit world if there is enough pain and trauma present. I don't think that energy goes away. I think locations hold on to the energy of everything that occurs there like a sponge. I didn't think that way as a child. I was raised by particularly non-religious parents. But after you have a few profound experiences, you can't forget them and they become part of you. I used to work as a janitor at a psychiatric hospital in eastern Pennsylvania. The place was just eerie in general, and unexplainable things would always happen. I'll talk about the experiences that freaked me out the most, but I could honestly write a book about all the things that happened there. Seeing shadow people move around, doors opening by themselves, objects falling off shelves, and constantly having supplies stolen were just about everyday occurrences. One day I was cleaning one of the bathrooms and felt a strong, menacing presence. I tried to ignore it and kept mopping the floors, but the feeling grew stronger and stronger. Finally, the tightness in my chest got to the point where I needed to address it. I asked if there was anybody in the bathroom with me. Immediately, all 6 of the sinks turned on. I put my hands up and shouted, "All right, that's enough, come on now." As soon as I said that, they all turned off. I tried to rationalize it as a sensor issue, so I said, "I bet you can't turn on just one." Without missing a beat, one of the faucets turned on full blast. I grabbed my stuff and moved on to the next room without finishing the bathroom. That was just way too much. I told my boss about the experience, and he leaned in close and told me I should never try to communicate with them. He said it often makes the situation worse. He said it's best to pretend they don't exist, and they'll leave you alone. They never left me alone, though. The spirits in that place probably fed off my fear. From the first day on the job, I knew that place was seriously haunted. I felt bad for the patients there. How could you possibly find sanity in an environment like that? One night, I was cleaning the offices in the bottom floor of the hospital, which is the same floor that the morgue was in. It was only me working down there at the time, and I saw this white-haired woman in white clothes running down the hall, towards the morgue, which was at the end of the hallway. I yelled at her that she couldn't be down here and it was a restricted area, but she kept running. She slammed through the morgue doors, and I took off after her, yelling at her to stop. When I got inside the morgue, there was not another living soul in there. I looked all over the place for her, but there was nobody in there. I got the hell out of there, and I will never forget that. I don't know if that was the spirit of a patient or a nurse, but either way, she was not at peace. I got pretty close with some of the patients there, and one of them claimed that they saw the white-haired woman all of the time. He was able to describe her in vivid detail exactly as I had seen her. That absolutely made my skin crawl. The absolute craziest thing happened to me late one night towards the end of my shift, and this is the thing that ended it all. I quit the job immediately after this. A patient had just died, and I was cleaning out her room. The electronics in there were going nuts. The TV kept turning on, the lights were flickering, my vacuum kept turning off. It was just chaos. I had just about given up cleaning that room altogether and was about to leave when the door slammed shut in my face. I was terrified and the room was completely dark. I was trying to feel around for the light switch when I heard a woman's voice say, "Where do you think you're going?" I froze and could hardly breathe. I said to her, "Look, I'm just trying to finish my shift and go home." She laughed and said, "You're not going home." I kept feeling around for something to defend myself with, and I asked her, "Where am I going then?" The lights then came back on, and I saw the same patient who had died. She was over by the window. She was staring at me and said as clear as day, "You're coming with me." I booked it out of there. I had already been seriously considering quitting, but this drove me over the edge. No paycheck is worth that kind of abuse, and life is too short to constantly worry about your safety. The strange thing was that when that patient was alive, she was always nice to me and seemed like a gentle lady. Maybe she had secret fantasies of killing me, but other than scaring the living hell out of me, this also hurt my feelings. If you're going to wish somebody harm, at least do it to their face and not behind their back. I don't know, though, if I had lived in a place like that for years, I would probably wish ill on people too. One thing's for sure, I'm so grateful I never have to go to that place ever again. The way I live my life now, if something feels off, I'm out of there. I've learned my lesson. We were given our senses to survive, and I honestly believe that if I stayed at that job, I would be dead, even if it was just from the stress and anxiety. I hope for anyone out there who has a job that makes their life miserable, you quit before your life passes you by. It was scary for me to leave that paycheck, and I had to move and do a lot of things to find another job, but I don't fear for my life all the time as I used to do. So this thing happened to me right at the beginning of that baby formula shortage. I don't know if you heard about it, but it was nearly impossible to find formula anywhere. And my baby was just 4 months old at the time, so I was desperate to get out there and find some. Every store I went to was completely out, just empty shelf after empty shelf. I went online to see if maybe I could find a recipe for formula. You know there are recipes, but then you read that making your own can be bad for the baby. Some even say dangerous because the ratio of water to nutrients, everything, is really precise in formula. I saw that the only short-term option aside from formula was canned evaporated milk, easy for babies to digest, so I thought that could be a backup. After I'd exhausted every avenue to find formula, the pediatrician, birthing centers, hospitals, calling every parent I could think of, nobody had anything extra to spare, and I couldn't afford to buy the breast milk that was being offered for sale. Then I saw this ad pop up on Facebook Marketplace, a picture of a case of formula sitting on top of a tall shelving unit. I messaged the guy, and he said he'd hold it for me. Says his adult daughter had a bunch of extra for her baby, who's a toddler now. She had put it in a storage unit last year and forgot about it. He asks if I'm tall because it's stored up high and he lost his legs and is in a wheelchair. I say, sure, I can do it myself, no problem, and I put a step stool in my car just in case. I leave the baby with my mom and the last few portions of formula I have left, planning to be back within an hour or so. I was feeling a tiny bit of relief, knowing that I'd soon have formula in my hands, but I was just eager to get it back. It's about a 30-minute drive from my place up near the airport. It started to look very industrial as I got closer to the storage facility. Once I pulled up to it, I entered the gate code the guy gave me and went in. The guy is waiting for me in his pickup. He waved to me and I drove up alongside and he says, "Can you go in on your own?" and handed me a small key that will unlock the padlock. He added that there is usually a loose guard dog on the premises and that he's a little scared of dogs, being in a chair and all. He says, "So just watch out." Well, I have 2 German Shepherds myself and dogs usually like me, so I wasn't worried. I parked, got out, and remembered to grab my step stool. And then, before I head in, I hear the dog he's talking about, panting. I remember I've got these dog treats in my glove box, so I real quick grab a few and put them in my hoodie pocket. Then I walk over and open the padlock and lift the door to the unit. Enough light spills in so I can see that the back wall is a storage shelf, and there's the formula from the photo. I push myself between rows of random boxes and get to the back. I reach up as high as I can but can barely brush my fingertips against it. So I set my step stool down. Next, I heard the dog again. I looked around but didn't see one. I whistled a couple of times. Then I noticed the guy and his truck were gone. It suddenly all seemed strange, and I get this eerie feeling about being there by myself. He left, but I hadn't even paid him. But I'm there for formula, and I'm determined to get it. So I quickly walk in, climb the stool, grab the formula, and head back out. As I'm doing this, I notice a reflection of eyes coming out from this tall ficus tree outside of the unit. I take a long second to study it. It could be a person messing with me, but the silhouette reminds me of a T-Rex. I even think maybe it's a statue of a T-Rex that someone was storing and just abandoned it when they emptied their unit. In any case, I'm not sticking around to find out. The hairs on my arms rise. I slam the unit door shut behind me and hear the key fall to the ground, but I just run to my truck, holding on to that formula. I scramble into my truck and lock it. When I turn around, I see that the storage unit door is only about halfway down, and what looks like this long lizard tail is sticking out of the storage unit. Whatever that was, I don't know how, but it seemed to have opened the door and was in there, rooting through boxes, knocking stuff over. Now I had to drive by the unit again. I had no choice because I was pulled up at the end of an area that was a dead end. So I just stepped on the gas and flew by it in reverse, and I heard the creature let out this god-awful screech. I can still hear it. I somehow drove home, and I was just shaking. The guy from FB Marketplace is nowhere to be found. I messaged him, texted him to Venmo, and nothing, no response. To this day, he's never returned my messages. I feel like, someone was playing a sick joke on me. Or maybe I'd somehow been tricked into being bait. I mean, that's how it felt, As for the formula, it was sealed, just shy of expiring. I didn't have a choice but to feed it to my baby. After that ran out, I figured evaporated milk would be just fine until the stores stocked up with formula again. When my baby is old enough, maybe I'll tell her this story. It sure is crazy what we'll do for our kids. After a crazy weekend in Vegas with some college friends, I was driving home to California. It was a pretty boring drive, especially at night, but I took my turn behind the wheel and put on the cruise control while my two friends slept, one in the passenger seat and one sprawled out in the back. I'd had a pretty good run at the casino, so I was combating middle-of-the-night highway hypnosis by thinking about how I was going to spend my winnings. I was trying to decide between a new couch and a new TV, when suddenly the entire car was filled with light. My first thought was that some jerk in a hopped-up truck had managed to come flying up behind me, but that didn't make sense. The landscape was so flat and featureless that there was no way I wouldn't have seen another vehicle approaching. My second thought was that we were being pulled over. That didn't make sense either. Where could a cop car possibly have been waiting out of sight to bust speeders or drunk drivers? I was so blinded by the bright light that I couldn't even see the highway in front of me. I slowed down, eventually coming to a stop in what I assumed was the middle of the road. Both of my friends started stirring, and I heard one of them say, "What's going on?" as I opened the car door and stepped out. The light was even brighter outside of the car. It was almost punishing. I looked around frantically, desperate to find the source. Was this some kind of trap designed to rip people off on their way outside of Vegas? I heard one of the car doors open, then the second, then one of my friends started screaming. I whirled around and his head was craned back at what looked like an unnatural angle. He was trapped in a beam of light. It was light green, different than the light that surrounded us. He looked frozen. His arm was extended, his index finger pointed straight up. I followed the angle, and then I started screaming too. It filled the entire sky. I couldn't even see the edges of it. It extended as far as I could see in every direction. My mind kept rejecting what I knew was happening. My brain just couldn't accept that I was seeing a UFO. I couldn't see what kind of material it was made of. All I could see were unending miles of blinking lights. I looked at my friend John, who was standing by the passenger door. His face mirrored the expression I felt on my own. Complete disbelief, shock, and fear. Eric was still trapped in the beam of light. He wasn't moving at all, but he was still screaming. John and I both clamped our hands over our ears as the beam of light changed and filled up with what looked like bubbles swarming around Eric's whole body. The bubbles were moving independently, but quite a few of them clustered around his head, while others circled around his body. As we watched in horror, a new sound filled the air. It sounded like a scanner at the grocery store, high-pitched beeping that increased in volume every second. I was fighting every nerve that was screaming at me to run. Where could I possibly hide? The desert is deadly at night, and as soon as the sun came up, I would be in danger of heat stroke. And that was assuming that I managed to escape whatever was piloting that UFO. But John had a different idea. He turned and ran at top speed, which wasn't very fast with the sand dragging around his feet. He was about 40 feet from the road when another beam of light shot out of the UFO and pinned him in place. It was the same color as the one holding Eric prisoner, and it quickly filled up with the same kind of bubbles that had John trapped. The high-pitched beeping sounded doubled. I assumed that it was only a matter of time before I got my own beam of light. I closed my eyes and waited. After what seemed like an eternity, the beeping finally stopped. I opened my eyes. John and Eric were both lying on the ground. I looked up and all I could see was wide open sky. Eric was sitting up by the time I got to him, and I looked over to see John struggling to stand. I helped them both up one by one and got them back to the car. Neither of them had any memory of anything after we checked out of our hotel. I told them what happened, but of course they didn't believe me. They both decided that they had overdone it on the booze. Or maybe their last drinks had been drugged. They conveniently overlooked the fact that both of them had been out of the car because they couldn't explain that part. But I know what really happened. I'll never forget it. But when we did actually get pulled over a few hours later, it was because I was driving like a bat out of hell to get that desert as far behind us as possible. I'll get straight to it. I think I saw a Mothman last year. My sister was there with me, but she swears up and down that that is not what happened. I think she's avoiding admitting it because she's too scared. So what happened was this. Me, my sister Charlotte, and our parents were on vacation. We were staying at my uncle's house near Los Angeles. He lives in a busy area, and there are a lot of new developments going on around his neighborhood. Specifically, he is only a few minutes away from this giant new housing community that's going up. Anyway, Charlotte is a real health nut, and she liked to take the dogs and go jogging at night, and I would usually go with her. Sometimes we'd jog past the housing development because I thought it was cool, all the frames for the houses and contracting equipment sitting around and stuff. It was quiet and we always had our phones on us, so it felt pretty safe. We had been doing this routine for a few nights, and it was fun to see the changes that were being completed each day on the buildings. But then, strangely, on the day this happened, I think a random Thursday, the streets were even emptier than usual. Anyway, we were jogging along when all of a sudden our dog stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. He started barking and growling and really straining at the leash, trying to pull us in the direction he was growling. And he was never like that. He never barks or really misbehaves. So there's me and Charlotte stopped in our tracks and trying to drag him away from whatever has got him freaked out so we can get him back home. But he's really freaking out. And he's a strong dog, so it's taking both of us and all our might to keep him in one place and not let him pull himself out of our hands. I followed his line of sight to try and see what was setting him off. And at first I think he's barking at the house itself. Then I realize he's actually looking above it, up towards the sky, so I look there. I can't see anything really, but it's it's never fully dark, right? I thought maybe he saw a falcon or something that looked like it was too close. But then Charlotte pointed to a black shape. It was circling over the house he was barking at, and it looked huge, even way up there. I couldn't make the details very well. But as I was looking and trying to make out what it was, it started flying toward us. Like it was nosediving towards us, and Baxter started howling. Now he was pulling at the lead and trying to drag us towards it. He wasn't giving up on fighting this thing. I thought for sure we were going to be attacked. The thing was flying fast right at us, and I realized more and more how massive it was. I could now make out for sure that it didn't look like any kind of animal I'd ever seen before. And I also thought I could make out that its eyes were red, and it had this strange pointed head with what looked like a long beak sticking out. Then right as it came to within 20 feet of us, I could feel the wind rushing around us, and Baxter was pulling to get to it, standing on his hind legs. That's when it pulled back up and flew over our heads so closely that we could have jumped and touched it. As it crossed over us, everything went black. That's just the enormity of the thing. It was terrifying. As soon as it passed over us, Charlotte and I made a break for it, screaming at and pulling Baxter. We all ran back to our uncle's house as fast as we could, and I didn't look back that entire run home. Charlotte and I were both really shaken up. Obviously, our parents knew something was wrong, but we just told them that Baxter has almost gotten away from us, and we were just scared from that. Charlotte stopped her evening jogging and didn't want to be outside at night anymore unless we were in a group and in the city, and I couldn't blame her. I, however, was still really curious and wanted to figure out what this thing was. So the following night, at about the same time of day, I took my uncle's binoculars and sat myself in a chair in his yard, facing the direction we had seen it. I sat there for hours. I told my parents I was birdwatching, but really I was curious. I wanted to see that thing again from the safety of the yard. It didn't appear, though, and by that point our vacation was almost over. Eventually I had to give up and come back inside. By then it was too dark anyway. Charlotte still maintains that the creature we saw was some kind of hawk or falcon, but I know that she knows that it was much, much bigger than that. I'm still trying to work out what it was, but it really stinks that I can't talk to her about it. She's basically giving me the silent treatment anytime I try and ask her about it. I work up in North Dakota at a truck dispatcher, working with flock freight and the like. I'm usually working in the office, but I sometimes get called over to our warehouse to do some work with allocating shipping equipment and things like that. I much prefer office work, especially during the winter. If you've never been to North Dakota in January, you sure are lucky because the winters out here are incredibly brutal. This season we had around 50 days that were below zero, and it's very rare that the sun comes out for more than a few hours. If you've ever watched the movie Fargo, you might have an idea of the weather out here. We can get a few feet of snow at a time, and it always sticks because the temperatures never get hot enough to melt it. Then, the entire blanket of snow becomes a thick sheet of ice that's nearly impossible to move. Our guys need to get out there exactly during and after a snowstorm to plow before it starts to freeze. Anyway, on this particular day, wouldn't it be my luck that one of the men who was supposed to plow called off sick? No one else could fill the shift because anyone who was able to plow was already out there plowing. So somehow, I got stuck with the job of shoveling out the driveway of the warehouse. My boss handed me the dinkiest shovel and a company-issued snow jacket and told me to get out there. I'd like to say right here that this was most certainly not in my job description. So during a snowstorm like this, the entire sky basically gets whited out. The clouds become a dark gray that covers up any blue, and the world just looks like it became a few shades dimmer. The wind was biting me, and I kept on having to pull down my hat or readjust my collar or pull up my gloves. After about 10 minutes of shoveling along the edge, I realized that the snow was melting in through my boots. Basically, leaking in through the fabric because I hadn't worn my heavy-duty pair to work, thinking I would just be working in the office. And all I wanted to do at this point was get home. If I wanted to get home, though, I'd have to drive out of the lot, and my car was getting covered and blockaded in by the dumping of snow. So once I cleared a small path out of the warehouse driveway and onto the road, I headed towards the parking lot to deal with my car. Now, I definitely didn't want to deal with anyone else's car, but I got to work dealing with and clearing my car. I started to push a layer off the hood. The snow was really coming down now, and the wind was whipping it all over the place, making it difficult to see what I was doing. When out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walking towards me. The wind was whipping, and the snow was moving like crazy with it. Sharp spikes of ice crystals were digging into my face, but I couldn't move to pull up my collar because I was concentrating on the figure, trying to focus on it and see who was coming at me. My first thought was that my boss was coming over to ask me to deal with the other cars, or at the very least his car. But what I saw was not a human. Once the figure got closer, I could see that it had dingy white and gray and brown fur. The fur was covered in ice particles, so it almost looked like it was shining and sparkling when they caught the light. My brain was still telling me that it was a coworker in some far-out snowsuit, but when I looked at its face, I realized there was no costume in the world that looked that realistic. This thing had a gray-black nose, almost like an ape, and it peered back at me with dark black eyes. Above its eyes was a thick brow that protruded like a caveman. It had white, furry knuckles, but its fingertip pads and palms were bare and gray. Its legs were like tree trunks, and he moved like a cross between an ape and a human. It started towards me, closer and closer, before I finally unfroze. I clicked into gear and quickly pulled out my key and hopped into my car. Now I hadn't finished clearing my windows, so I couldn't see very clearly where the creature was at first. But then I saw in next to me, and it started circling my car, never getting closer than a foot away. By the way, I promise I'm not making this up. After it circled my car, it moved towards my front window and leaned heavily on the hood. The car started to move downwards in the front under the massive weight of it. So, I decided to lean on the horn, hoping that would go in my favor and not backfire. Luckily, this worked, and the thing was totally spooked. I still couldn't see clearly, but I felt the car lift back up and then nothing. No movement and no noise. I sat there for 5 minutes or so, just hoping and praying that nothing more would happen. I hoped that it had run off the same way it came, back towards the interstate in the woods. When I got out of the car, my hood was dented in the front and there was a stink in the air like garbage. I looked down at the snow and could distinctly make out the tracks in the snow. I started to run back inside to tell my coworkers when a pickup truck started to move into the parking lot. I tried to get him to stop, but I guess he didn't see me, and he went and plowed right through the tracks. I brought out my buddies, and even though they could see the tracks in the snow by the woods, they told me that I was just screwing with them. After that day, I haven't really wanted to tell my story. If you are based in North Dakota, please be aware that there may be this creature lurking nearby, and snowstorms are definitely not a safe time to be outside.